Good morning. A certain photo made the rounds on social media and the news cycles a few weeks ago. It showed President Putin attending a midnight mass for Easter worship. He stood next to the mayor of Moscow in a church in Moscow, lighting candles, crossing himself, worshiping the risen Christ. Commentators pounced on the photo, denouncing the egregious hypocrisy and the implicit nationalism inherent in it. And it's easy to look at a picture like that and think, well, that person's religion is worthless. James, in his letter this morning, wants to help us explore that idea, especially the ways in which it may play out in our own lives today, in much more common ways. In the first half of James chapter 1, which we looked at last Sunday morning, we saw how James focuses on this call to be perfect, a word that means mature, to grow up in our faith, to reach the goal of our faith. In the second half of James chapter 1, which we'll look at this morning, James focuses on what that perfection, that growth looks like when it comes to religion. And so James makes this claim in verses 26 and 27, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this. So James believes that there is indeed a way of practicing religion that makes it worthless. And there is a way of practicing religion that makes it pure and undefiled. What's the difference between the two? Just what does worthless religion look like? Well, James begins answering that question by talking about language. So verse 19 of James 1, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your soul. James begins this conversation about worthless religion by talking about language. And the reason is this. Language, when abused or misused in James's way of thinking, is one of the primary ways in which we exclude others. And it's that exclusion that makes that religion so worthless. An example, Yang Vo is the author of a children's book called Gibberish. And it's a story of the way in which language can exclude and displace people. In the book, Dat is a young boy who, along with his mother, moves to a new place where the language is strange and foreign to them. And so when Dat gets on the school bus to head to school that first morning, the bus driver mangles his name, his teacher mangles his name, and his attempts in the playground to connect with other kids are useless. And then all of a sudden, out of a tree in the playground drops a young girl named Julie. And Julie tries to communicate using her hands and drawing pictures on the dirt in the playground. And a social connection starts to happen between the two. In the book, all the people that live in this new place are colorless, gray monsters. And Dat and his mother are full-color humans. And the language spoken by the monsters is represented on the pages as gibberish, just symbols and letters, nonsensical. But as this young Julie makes more and more attempts to communicate with Dat, she's transformed from this colorless monster into a full-color human being. And it's the author's way of trying to capture what it's like when language is a barrier to connection, when language becomes a means of disconnection. And that's what James is warning about in the second half of his letter. He's warning people in faith communities, people who follow Jesus, to not be slow to hear, to not be quick to speak, and to not be quick to anger. Because that use of language disconnects and excludes and hurts other people. And so James instead urges us to be quick to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger. Because the failure to do so, the failure to bridle the tongue, he says, is what actually makes our religion worthless. Now, it may be a little difficult for us to bring those two things together. On the one hand, to see a picture of a dictator going to war and worshiping the risen Christ, and to say, well, that's a worthless religion. And now to listen to James, who is talking about people in a faith community who simply use language in ways that are driven by anger and thus exclude others, and to hear James say, and that religion is also worthless. But what James is trying to help us see is that the misuse of language is, in fact, an act of violence against others. In 1993, Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And in her acceptance speech, she told a story that is found in many cultures. It's a story about an old woman who is wise and blind. Some children approach her, intending to taunt her, tease her. One of the children walks up to her and says, "Old woman, I hold in my hands a bird. Can you tell if the bird is living or dead?" And at first, the blind, old, wise woman refuses to answer the children, doesn't want to play their game. But eventually, she says, "Whether the bird is living or dead in your hands, I do not know. What I do know is that the bird is in your hands." And the common interpretation is that she's admonishing the children. She's saying, that bird is in your hands, and it's now your responsibility whether the bird lives or dies. And she went on to say in her speech that the bird represents language, and that bird is in the hands of every person on earth. And whether that language lives or dies, whether that language hurts or helps, is the responsibility of every person alive. And so she said, oppressive language does more than represent violence. It is violence. More than represents the limits of knowledge. It limits knowledge. And that's what James is saying here in the second half of chapter 1. He's saying that the misuse of language is violence. And the responsibility to use language in ways that create community is the responsibility of every one of us. So what then does pure and undefiled religion really look like, according to James? He goes on to say this, verse 21, therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls, but be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away, and at once forgets what he saw, what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. James says, pure and undefiled religion begins not by speaking, and especially not by speaking in anger, but by listening, by hearing the implanted word, by hearing the perfect law, by hearing the law of liberty. This is James's way of talking about Scripture. Pure and undefiled religion begins by listening to Scripture. More specifically, James is thinking here about the words of Jesus and the words about Jesus. James is saying when heard correctly, when received correctly, the words of Jesus and the words about Jesus move us toward perfection, the focus of the first part of the chapter, and to move us away from the kind of speaking that does so much damage in the world. So how do the words of Jesus do that? Well, James asks us to think about a mirror. He's used the image of filthiness and stain in verse 21 and verse 27, and so now he wants us to think about looking into a mirror with filthiness, with stain on our face. And we look into the mirror and we see the filthiness, we see the stain on our face, and then we walk away and we do nothing about it. And James says that would be ridiculous. Why? Well, because a mirror is intended to prompt some self-reflection that leads to self-improvement. And James is saying the words of Jesus, the words about Jesus, likewise are intended to prompt some self-reflection that leads to self-improvement. And so worthless religion, James is saying, looks like a group of Christians who come together to receive the words of Jesus, to study the words of Jesus, and we pull out our commentaries and we listen to our podcasts and we learn a little Greek language. We learn about the Jewish customs of the day. But we never allow those words to do what they were intended to do, to prompt self-reflection that leads to self-improvement. And so in this way, James is mirroring the words of his brother Jesus. And we'll see throughout James how James is constantly thinking back, especially to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus ends his Sermon on the Mount with these words, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it didn't fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So Jesus ends his Sermon on the Mount by saying, you need to hear these words and put them into action. And James begins his letter now by saying, you need to hear these words, receive them, and put them into action. That's what the words are intended to do. That's what pure and undefiled religion looks like. And then to put a point on it, James says this, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. James identifies two groups here, widows and orphans. And he doesn't identify them because somehow they're more important than other groups in the ancient world. He identifies them because these are two groups who experience life without community, who experience life as disconnected from others. So orphans are young people who don't have parents who provide for them and care for them and companion with them through life. They're disconnected from that natural network that so many other children have. In the same way, widows are older people who now don't have partners who provide for them and care for them and companion with them in life. They've been removed from that natural network that so many other older humans have. And it's that disconnection. It's that marginalization. It's that feeling of being excluded that leads James to mention these two groups. Because for James, pure and undefiled religion is one that focuses on creating community for those who have none. That's the meaning of his call to visit orphans and widows in their distress. That word visit means to care for, means to provide for, means to step into the place that those parents once played, to step into those shoes that those partners once played, to become the community that is now missing in their lives. For James, that's what pure and undefiled religion looks like. Worthless religion. Religion that has no value to it all. Is Christians and faith communities acting in ways that disconnect, that exclude, especially through language that's thoughtless, that's careless, that's driven by anger. And pure and undefiled religion looks like Christians and faith communities that focus instead on connecting and creating community, especially for groups most missing it in their lives. There was a movie recently on Netflix called Blue Miracle. And it tells the true story of a group in need of connection and community, Casa Hogar in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. Casa Hogar was started by a man named Oscar who grew up on the streets of Mexico, an orphan himself. And when he became an adult with some resources, he decided to help other boys who were just like him living in the streets. And so he and others started Casa Hogar. Eventually it grew to the point that they were feeding and clothing and helping about 40 young boys, providing a home for them. And then in 2014, a hurricane swept through that part of Mexico, and it devastated the orphanage, and it looked like they were just going to have to release those 40 boys back into the streets of Mexico. It devastated not only that orphanage, but a large part of that area, including the economy of that area. And so that year, one of the largest fishing tournaments in the sport, the Bisbee Black and Blue Fishing Tournament, was going to be canceled. It's normally one of the most expensive tournaments to be held, $5,000 for an entry fee, and boasts some of the highest prize money in the fishing sport. But because canceling that fishing tournament would mean another blow to the area, wealthy donors stepped in and said they would pay the $5,000 fee for anybody who decided to participate that year. And so Oscar at Casa Hogar and some of the boys said, well, let's enter the fishing tournament. Something they'd never been able to afford before, but now it was free. And so they did. 8 of the boys from the orphanage entered the fishing tournament along with Oscar. And none of the 8 boys who'd ever fished before were now part of that tournament. And wouldn't you know it, true story, wouldn't you know it, by the end of the fishing tournament, they hauled in the winning prize, a $385 pound blue marlin, and they won $258,000 for that fish. They not only saved the orphanage, but allowed them to expand the orphanage's ministry so that they could clothe and house and feed young women as well as young men. And stories like that are inspiring stories. But the problem is that they are all too rare. What is more common, what is happening in everyday life, is that there are groups of people in our communities who never get that kind of break, who never experience that kind of luck, who never land any fish like that, and who live every single day excluded from the life-giving community that they need to thrive. And James is saying that pure religion is a religion that cares about that. Now that's why last Sunday's contribution for Shiloh was so important. And thank you so much for helping us to exceed that $7,000 goal, because all of that money goes to at-risk youth in New York City. Children who for so many reasons stand outside of the life-giving community they need to thrive. That's why our contribution at the end of this June for Hope for Haiti's Children is so important, because it goes to at-risk children in Haiti who face so many obstacles to having a life that thrives. It creates life-giving community for them. And that's why last Sunday we launched for the first time Friends Speak. It's a ministry that recognizes that right here in our own community, language does create disconnection, but it can create connection. And it's a ministry that will allow us to create networks of friendship and fellowship with others in our community who so desperately need it. For James, that is what pure and undefiled religion looks like in our day. As we close this morning, I want to encourage you to think about these two questions in the silence that follows. In what ways does my practice of religion create disconnection and disunity, making it worthless? And in what ways does my practice of religion create connection and community, making it pure and undefiled?